Nobody expected the Canadians to be lethal. During the first years of World War II, soldiers from Canada were seen as inexperienced recruits, farmers and factory workers who barely knew how to hold a rifle. Even Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces, had expressed his doubts in private. "They're amateurs," he said after observing the first Canadian maneuvers on British soil. "They don't have the discipline or the killer instinct needed for modern warfare." His staff nodded in agreement. The Canadians seemed polite, almost too friendly for war. They lacked the aggression of American Marines, the precision of British regulars, the ruthless efficiency of Soviet shock troops. They were considered second-tier soldiers at best. But Eisenhower didn't know what was coming. He didn't know about Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, a tactical genius who would revolutionize armored warfare. He didn't know about the Canadian snipers who were about to become the most feared marksmen on the Western Front. And he certainly didn't know that these so-called amateurs would annihilate over 360,000 enemy soldiers in some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. This is the story of how Canada's forgotten warriors proved everyone wrong. The year was 1942. Britain was desperate. The Soviet Union was bleeding. America had just entered the war but was still mobilizing its forces. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, and Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The disaster at Dieppe had just occurred, a catastrophic raid where Canadian forces were slaughtered on the beaches of France. Over 900 Canadians died in just 9 hours. 2,000 more were captured. The operation was a complete failure, and it confirmed what many Allied commanders already believed: the Canadians weren't ready for real combat. Eisenhower reviewed the casualty reports with his chief of staff. "This confirms it," he said, tapping the papers with his finger. "The Canadians are brave, I'll give them that. But bravery without skill gets men killed. We can't rely on them for critical operations." His assessment was shared by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who privately referred to Canadian units as enthusiastic but undisciplined. The Canadians were assigned to garrison duties, training exercises, defensive positions. They were kept away from the main action. But something was changing in the Canadian ranks. The humiliation of Dieppe had ignited a fire. These men weren't content to be dismissed as amateurs. They began training with an intensity that shocked their British instructors. They practiced marksmanship until their fingers bled. They studied German tactics, German equipment, German psychology. And they found a leader who understood their potential. Guy Simonds was only 39 years old when he took command of the 2nd Canadian Corps, making him one of the youngest lieutenant generals in the entire Allied forces. He was cold, calculating, and absolutely brilliant. While other commanders relied on overwhelming firepower and frontal assaults, Simonds studied the Germans like a scientist studying a predator. He noticed patterns in their movements, weaknesses in their doctrine, gaps in their defenses. He began developing tactics that would later be copied by armies around the world. Simonds believed in 3 principles. First, surprise was more valuable than numbers. Second, night attacks could neutralize German advantages in firepower. Third, infantry and armor had to work together as a single organism, not as separate units. These ideas were revolutionary in 1943, and many senior officers dismissed them as naive. But Simonds didn't care what they thought. He had something to prove. The Canadian snipers were being forged in the same fire. Most of them came from rural backgrounds, men who had grown up hunting in the forests of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. They knew how to read terrain, how to remain invisible, how to wait for hours without moving. Their instructors quickly realized these men had natural talents that couldn't be taught. One British sniper trainer reported, "The Canadians have an instinct for this work. They're patient, methodical, and they don't miss." The Canadian snipers began developing techniques that would become legendary. They worked in pairs, moving at night, setting up positions before dawn. They studied wind patterns, temperature changes, light conditions. They learned to slow their heartbeat, to breathe in rhythm, to squeeze the trigger between breaths. But skills alone weren't enough. They needed the right equipment. The Lee-Enfield rifle, standard issue for Commonwealth forces, was accurate but not specialized for long-range precision work. Canadian snipers began modifying their weapons, adding custom scopes, adjusting trigger pulls, hand-loading ammunition for consistency. Some even carved new stocks to fit their individual shooting styles. They were perfectionists, obsessed with every detail that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss. By late 1943 the Canadians were ready. But nobody knew it yet. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 would be their first test. The 1st Canadian Division landed alongside British and American forces, And once again the Canadians were given what seemed like a secondary role. They were assigned to capture small towns in the interior while American and British units took the major objectives. Eisenhower's staff barely paid attention to the Canadian sector. It was considered a quiet zone. They were catastrophically wrong. The Canadians moved through Sicily like ghosts. German and Italian defenders reported something terrifying. Their officers were dying. Commanders were shot while observing positions. Machine gunners were killed before they could fire. Radio operators collapsed with bullets through their chests. The Germans couldn't see where the shots were coming from. Canadian snipers were operating at ranges that seemed impossible, hitting targets at over 800 meters with shocking consistency. One German report captured after the campaign described invisible gunmen who kill from distances we cannot return fire. But it was Simonds' tactical innovations that truly shocked the enemy. He coordinated infantry and tank movements with radio communication, something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. His units moved at night, using darkness to get close to German positions before launching dawn attacks. He used artillery not just for bombardment but for precise suppression, timing barrages to the second so his infantry could advance under the explosions. German commanders had never faced coordination like this. They were used to predictable Allied attacks. Massive artillery followed by tanks followed by infantry. Simonds mixed everything together, creating chaos in German command structures. One battle exemplified the new Canadian approach. The town of Leonforte was defended by German paratroopers, elite soldiers considered among the best in the Wehrmacht. British and American units had struggled against these troops in other sectors. But Simonds planned something different. He sent his infantry through the town at night, bypassing strong points, infiltrating deep into German positions. At dawn, his tanks rolled forward, not to lead the attack but to support infantry that was already behind enemy lines. The German paratroopers found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting in all directions. Within 18 hours, Leonforte fell. German casualties were devastating. Canadian losses were minimal. Reports reached Eisenhower's headquarters. At first he didn't believe them. "Check these numbers again," he told his intelligence officer. "There must be an error." But the numbers were correct. The Canadians were advancing faster than any other unit in Sicily. Their casualty ratios were better than veteran British divisions. And German prisoners kept telling the same story: the Canadians fought differently, moved differently, killed differently. Montgomery, who commanded all ground forces in Sicily, began paying attention. He visited Canadian positions and spoke with Simonds personally. "Your men are performing exceptionally," Montgomery said, and coming from a commander known for his arrogance, this was extraordinary praise. "I may have underestimated your capabilities." Simonds didn't smile. He simply replied, "We're just getting started." Sicily fell, and the Allies prepared to invade mainland Italy. Once again the Canadians were given a role, but this time expectations were higher. They landed at Calabria and began pushing north through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The Italian mountains were perfect for defense, and the Germans had turned every ridge, every river, every town into a fortress. This was going to be brutal. The Moro River campaign in December 1943 became a nightmare. The Germans had fortified the area with machine gun nests, minefields, artillery positions and anti-tank guns. The river itself was swollen with winter rain, making crossing almost impossible. British units had attempted to break through and been thrown back with heavy casualties. Eisenhower's staff predicted the Canadians would get bogged down for weeks. Simonds studied the German positions for 3 days. His officers expected him to order a frontal assault, the standard approach. Instead he did something unexpected. He attacked at night in a rainstorm, using specialized assault teams trained for close-quarters combat. These teams crossed the river in darkness, infiltrated German positions, and began silencing machine gun nests with grenades and bayonets. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand combat in the mud and darkness. German defenders panicked. They couldn't see their attackers. They couldn't coordinate their defense. By dawn, the Canadians had established a bridgehead. But the Germans counterattacked with everything they had. Panzers rolled forward. Artillery pounded Canadian positions. For 3 days the battle raged without pause. This was where Canadian snipers earned their fearsome reputation. They positioned themselves in ruined buildings, in trees, in shell craters, anywhere they could get a clear line of fire. And they began systematically destroying German command structure. One Canadian sniper, whose name was never recorded in official reports, killed 17 German officers in a single day. He targeted anyone giving orders, anyone holding binoculars, anyone pointing directions. Without leadership, German units became confused, hesitant. Another sniper team eliminated an entire machine gun position by killing the gunner, then killing each replacement as they tried to take over the weapon. After the fourth man died, nobody else would touch the gun. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers began refusing to move during daylight. They cowered in their foxholes, terrified of the invisible killers. One captured German lieutenant told his interrogators, "We knew we were fighting Canadians, but we didn't know they were demons. Our men are afraid to look over the parapet. Every time an officer tries to organize a defense, he dies. How do you fight ghosts?" The Moro River eventually fell. The Canadians pushed forward and the Germans retreated. But the cost was high. Hundreds of Canadian soldiers died in those battles. Yet the casualty ratios told a story that shocked military analysts. For every Canadian killed, 7 Germans died. This was unprecedented. Usually, attackers suffered higher casualties than defenders. But the Canadians had reversed that equation. News reached Eisenhower in England, where he was planning the invasion of France. He called for detailed reports on Canadian operations. He studied Simonds' tactics. He reviewed casualty figures. And slowly his opinion began to change. "These aren't the same troops we saw in 1942, he told his staff. "Something's different. They're fighting like veterans." But he still had doubts. Italy was one thing. France would be different. The invasion of Normandy would be the real test. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Canadian forces landed on Juno Beach alongside British and American troops. This was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and everyone knew the stakes. If it failed, the war might be lost. The Germans had fortified the French coast with massive concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, mines, obstacles. It was called the Atlantic Wall, and Hitler had declared it impregnable. Juno Beach was one of the most heavily defended sectors. German intelligence had predicted the Allies might land there, so they had concentrated forces. The 3rd Canadian Division faced a nightmare. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft, mines everywhere. The first waves took horrific casualties. Men were cut down before they reached the sand. Landing craft exploded on underwater obstacles. Bodies floated in the surf. But the Canadians didn't stop. They pushed forward through the carnage using tactics learned in Sicily and Italy. Small teams flanked bunkers while others provided covering fire. Snipers targeted German observers directing artillery. Engineers blew gaps through obstacles. Slowly, methodically, the Canadians clawed their way off the beach. By nightfall, they had advanced further inland than any other Allied division. They had achieved all their D-Day objectives, something that neither the Americans at Omaha Beach nor the British at Gold and Sword Beaches could claim. Eisenhower visited the Normandy beaches 3 days after the invasion. He walked along Juno Beach, seeing the wreckage of the battle. He met with Canadian commanders and saw maps showing their progress. The Canadians had pushed almost 12 kilometers inland, deeper than anyone else. They had captured several towns and created a solid defensive perimeter. And they had done it with fewer casualties than predicted. Eisenhower stood on a bluff overlooking the beach and said quietly to his aide, "I was wrong about them. These men are not amateurs." But the real bloodbath was still coming. The battle for Caen would become one of the most brutal fights of the entire war. The city was a crucial objective, a transportation hub that controlled access to the interior of France. British forces had expected to capture it on D-Day itself. Instead, the Germans turned Caen into a fortress. Elite SS Panzer divisions moved into the area, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, fanatical teenagers who had been indoctrinated since childhood to worship Hitler and fight to the death. The Hitler Youth Division was notorious for its savagery. These weren't regular soldiers. They were ideological warriors who took no prisoners, who killed wounded enemy soldiers, who burned villages and murdered civilians. When they learned they would be fighting Canadians, they were dismissive. "The Canadians are weak," their commander Kurt Meyer told his officers. "They lack the will to fight a real war. We will crush them." They met in the fields outside Caen, and the result was carnage like nothing seen before on the Western Front. The Hitler Youth attacked with fanatical courage, throwing themselves at Canadian positions in human wave assaults. Canadian machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Bodies piled up in the wheat fields. But the SS kept coming, stepping over their dead comrades, screaming Nazi slogans, dying in their hundreds. The Canadians didn't break. They had been tested in Sicily and Italy. They knew how to kill and they knew how to survive. When the Hitler Youth attacked, Canadian forces used coordinated defense tactics that turned battles into slaughterhouses. Artillery fire was timed to explode just as SS troops reached Canadian lines. Machine gun positions were set in overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones that nothing could cross. And Canadian snipers went to work. The snipers specifically targeted Hitler Youth officers and NCOs. Within the first week of fighting, the 12th SS Panzer Division lost over 40% of its leadership cadre. Junior officers were promoted and died within hours. The division began to lose cohesion. Units became separated, confused, unable to coordinate. And the Canadians pushed forward, meter by bloody meter, through wheat fields that turned red with blood. One battle near the village of Authie became legendary. A Hitler Youth battalion tried to surround a Canadian company that was holding a farmhouse. The Germans had tanks, artillery support, and overwhelming numbers. The Canadians had 150 men, some anti-tank guns, and their rifles. The Hitler Youth commander was certain of victory. He radioed his superiors, "The Canadians are trapped. We will annihilate them within the hour." 6 hours later, the Hitler Youth battalion had been destroyed. Over 300 SS soldiers lay dead in the fields around the farmhouse. Canadian snipers had turned the battle into a shooting gallery, killing anyone who moved. Anti-tank teams destroyed 4 Panzer tanks at close range. And when the Hitler Youth finally retreated, the Canadians counterattacked, pursuing them and inflicting even more casualties. The Canadian company suffered 23 casualties. The exchange ratio was 13-1. Guy Simonds was promoted to command the 2nd Canadian Corps, and he began planning operations that would become case studies in military academies. Operation Totalize in August 1944 was his masterpiece. The objective was to break through German lines south of Caen and advance toward Falaise. The Germans had prepared a defense in depth with multiple fortified lines, anti-tank guns, artillery, and panzer reserves. Every previous attempt to break through had failed with heavy casualties. Simonds created something completely new. He converted self-propelled artillery vehicles into armored personnel carriers, giving his infantry protection and mobility. He planned a night attack using radio beams to guide his forces in the darkness. He coordinated massive bomber strikes with ground advances, using heavy bombers to pulverize German positions just before his troops arrived. Nobody had attempted anything like this before. The attack launched at midnight on August 7. 76 converted armored carriers rumbled forward in the darkness, guided by radio beams, heading straight for German positions. The Germans heard them coming but couldn't see them, couldn't coordinate a defense. At dawn, heavy bombers from the Royal Air Force arrived and dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German fortifications. The earth shook. Bunkers collapsed. Entire units were buried alive. Then the Canadians struck. Infantry poured out of the armored carriers and overwhelmed stunned German defenders. Tanks followed, exploiting gaps in the line. Canadian forces advanced 10 kilometers in the first 12 hours, the deepest single-day advance since D-Day. German commanders panicked. The 12th SS Panzer Division, already decimated from weeks of fighting, tried to counterattack and was annihilated. Over 4,000 SS soldiers died in 3 days. But Simonds wasn't done. Operation Tractable followed a week later, using similar tactics to close the Falaise pocket, a trap that would capture or destroy an entire German army. The Canadians pushed south while American forces pushed north, creating a pocket with over 100,000 German soldiers trapped inside. The Germans tried desperately to escape, launching breakout attacks, sacrificing rearguard units to buy time. But the Canadians held the northern edge of the pocket with incredible determination. The fighting was apocalyptic. German units threw themselves at Canadian positions in desperate attempts to break through. Thousands died in suicidal charges. The roads became clogged with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, corpses. Allied aircraft strafed the pocket continuously, turning it into a killing ground. And Canadian snipers positioned themselves on the ridges overlooking the escape routes, picking off German officers, vehicle drivers, anyone trying to organize the retreat. When the Falaise pocket finally closed on August 21, the result was catastrophic for Germany. Estimates vary, but between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. Another 50,000 were captured. Hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned. 2 entire German armies ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. And Canadian forces had been central to this victory. Eisenhower toured the battlefield after the slaughter. The devastation shocked even him, a man who had seen years of warfare. "This is the end of the German army in France," he said to his staff. He specifically mentioned Canadian performance in his reports to Washington and London. The Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Simonds performed with exceptional skill and aggression. Their contribution to the destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket cannot be overstated. This was extraordinary praise from a commander who had once dismissed the Canadians as amateurs. But the war wasn't over. The Canadians pushed into Belgium and the Netherlands, liberating towns and cities, fighting brutal battles against German units that refused to surrender. The Scheldt estuary campaign in October and November 1944 became another nightmare. The Germans had flooded polders, turned dikes into fortresses, mined everything. The terrain was horrific, a maze of water, mud, and fortifications. British commanders looked at the mission and estimated it would take months with tens of thousands of casualties. Simonds and the Canadians did it in 5 weeks. They used specialized equipment, amphibious vehicles, and innovative tactics to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. They fought through flooded fields, clearing German positions one by one. Canadian snipers adapted their techniques for the unique terrain, using church steeples, windmills, and farm buildings as hides. They targeted German artillery spotters, preventing accurate fire on advancing Canadian units. The liberation of the Netherlands became intensely personal for Canadian soldiers. They saw Dutch civilians starving, brutalized by years of Nazi occupation. They saw children with distended bellies from malnutrition. They saw the desperation in people's eyes. And something hardened in the Canadian troops. They had fought professionally in Sicily, Italy, and France. But in the Netherlands they fought with fury. German units that might have received quarter in other battles found none from the Canadians in Holland. SS units were shown no mercy. Soldiers who had collaborated with the Nazis were dealt with harshly. The Canadians became liberation forces and avengers simultaneously. And the Dutch people never forgot. To this day, Canadian war graves in the Netherlands are maintained with loving care by Dutch families. Canadian flags fly in Dutch cities every May 5th, Liberation Day. The bond forged in those desperate months has never been broken. By early 1945, the Canadian Army had become one of the most effective fighting forces in the entire Allied coalition. They had fought from Sicily to the Netherlands, liberated millions of people, destroyed dozens of German divisions. And their casualty ratios were among the best of any Allied army. They had killed or captured over 360,000 enemy soldiers, a staggering number for a nation with a population of only 11 million people. Eisenhower's transformation was complete. In his memoirs, written after the war, he devoted significant space to Canadian contributions. "I initially underestimated the Canadian forces," he wrote. "This was a grave error in judgment. The Canadian Corps proved to be one of the most formidable fighting formations under my command. Their tactical innovations, fighting spirit, and consistent performance in difficult operations earned them a reputation as elite troops." This was a remarkable admission from a man not known for admitting mistakes. Guy Simonds retired after the war with a reputation as one of the finest tactical commanders of the entire conflict. Military historians still study his innovations. The use of armored personnel carriers, night attacks guided by electronic navigation, close coordination between air and ground forces. These concepts became standard doctrine in modern armies. Simonds had revolutionized warfare, and he had done it while commanding troops that others had dismissed as second-rate. The Canadian snipers became legends. Their techniques were studied by sniper schools around the world. The patience, the precision, the psychological warfare they employed set standards that modern snipers still try to match. Some of their kill counts were so high that military officials classified them, fearing they would be dismissed as propaganda. But the numbers were real. And German veterans who survived the war spoke with genuine fear about the Canadian ghost shooters, who had killed their officers and broken their morale. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler. The Canadians had proved that heart, determination, and intelligent leadership could overcome initial disadvantages. They had been mocked, dismissed, underestimated by almost everyone. And they had responded not with words but with action. They had fought their way from the beaches of Sicily to the heart of Germany, liberating millions, destroying one of history's most evil regimes, and earning respect through blood and sacrifice. When the war ended, Canadian soldiers returned home to a nation that hadn't fully grasped what they had accomplished. There were parades and medals, but Canada didn't glorify military achievement the way other nations did. The soldiers went back to their farms, their factories, their ordinary lives. They didn't talk much about what they had done. And slowly the world began to forget. But the German army never forgot. Captured documents from Wehrmacht archives show consistent respect and fear of Canadian units. After-action reports describe Canadian attacks as highly aggressive and well-coordinated. Intelligence assessments rate Canadian divisions as equivalent to elite German formations. This from an army that considered itself the finest in the world. The Canadians had earned respect from their enemies, perhaps the highest compliment any soldier can receive. Eisenhower's initial dismissal of the Canadians as amateurs became a cautionary tale in military circles. Don't underestimate an enemy or an ally based on superficial assessments. Don't assume that inexperience equals incompetence. Don't forget that warriors are forged in battle, not in peacetime exercises. The Canadians had arrived in Britain as uncertain recruits and left Europe as hardened veterans who had changed the course of history. The 360,000 enemy casualties inflicted by Canadian forces represent more than just numbers. Each one was a battle fought, a position taken, a town liberated. Behind those statistics are stories of incredible courage, brilliant tactics, and determination that refused to break even in the worst conditions. They represent the transformation of a nation from colonial backwater to world power, from dismissed amateurs to respected warriors. And they represent the vindication of Guy Simonds and every Canadian soldier who refused to accept other people's low expectations. They proved that being underestimated could be an advantage, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, that heart and intelligence could beat reputation and tradition. They rewrote the rules of warfare and helped destroy Nazi Germany in the process. Today, when military historians discuss World War II, they focus on American production, British resilience, Soviet sacrifice, German technical skill. The Canadian contribution is often reduced to a footnote, a supporting role. But the numbers tell a different story. So do the tactics that modern armies still use. So do the German veterans who fought them and survived to tell the tale. Eisenhower learned his lesson. By the end of the war, he had become one of the strongest advocates for Canadian military capability. He pushed for Canada to have a major role in post-war military planning. He recommended Canadian officers for high-level NATO positions. And he never again dismissed troops based on their nationality or initial appearance. The amateurs he had mocked had taught him humility, and they had earned his deepest respect. The story of the Canadian Army in World War II is a story about exceeding expectations. It's about taking humiliation and turning it into motivation. It's about leaders like Simonds who refused to accept conventional wisdom and created new ways of fighting. It's about snipers who turned patience and precision into an art form. It's about ordinary men from farms and small towns who became extraordinary soldiers. And it's about a nation that punched far above its weight and changed history in the process. 360,000 enemy casualties. When measured against a population of 11 million, that number becomes even more staggering. Canada fielded an army of roughly 750,000 personnel during the war. The kill ratio was almost 1 to 2. For every Canadian soldier who served, 2 enemy soldiers were killed or captured. This is unprecedented in modern warfare. Not even the vaunted German Wehrmacht achieved such ratios. And they did it while liberating rather than conquering. Canadian forces were welcomed as heroes in Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. They weren't occupiers. They were liberators. They gave away their rations to starving civilians. They played with children who hadn't smiled in years. They restored hope to people who had lived under Nazi tyranny. This combination of military effectiveness and human decency created a legacy that endures. The transformation was complete. The amateurs had become masters. The mocked had become feared. The dismissed had become essential. And Eisenhower, who had started the war doubting Canadian capability, ended it knowing that some of his finest troops wore the maple leaf on their shoulders. His initial judgment had been catastrophically wrong, and 360,000 enemy casualties proved it beyond any doubt. This is the story that should be told. Not just as Canadian history but as human history. Because it proves that potential can be hidden, that greatness can emerge from unexpected places, and that those who are underestimated often become the ones who change everything. The Canadian soldiers of World War II earned their place among the greatest warriors of the 20th century. They just did it so quietly that the world forgot to notice. But their enemies noticed. And Eisenhower noticed. And that was enough.